Thanks, everyone. Sorry for the brief delay. We'll just give everyone a few more seconds. All right. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford Free University. Maybe you're taking a break from watching the impeachment hearings about violence and democracy in the United States, and you now want to watch an hour seminar about a military coup in Myanmar. I mistakenly tweeted this yesterday as a military coup in Malaysia before realizing that that was incorrect, which is a relief. So today we are thrilled to have Dan Slater as our speaker. He's a Ronald and Eileen Weiser Professor of Emerging Democracies in the Department of Political Science at the University of Michigan, where he's also director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. He specializes in democracy and authoritarianism with a focus on Southeast Asia, and he's written numerous books and articles on the topic. We are delighted that today he'll be speaking about the military coup that just took place in Myanmar, some of its historical origins and possible trajectories for the future. If you have any questions, this is just a quick process point about the webinar. Please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And for those of you who are Stanford CDVRL affiliates, if you're interested in unmuting to ask your question during Q&A, please indicate that with your question. Otherwise, the default is going to be that I will be floating questions to Dan in the Q&A, which we will get to in about 30 minutes after we hear him speak. So without further ado, thank you, Dan, and thank you to our viewers.
Well, thank you, Dee Dee. Obviously delighted to speak with you, although not delighted to be speaking about this topic and have this having come up again in February, 2021 being the gift that keeps on giving, just like 2020 was. So there was a coup on February 1st. The military in Myanmar locked up the civilian leadership and prevented parliament from convening. And so what I want to sort of do today is just be kind of informal, no slides. I just kind of want to do this sort of more seminar style and basically just ask a series of questions and try to help us maybe think through this a little bit, collectively. So how did Myanmar get here historically? Does it make any sense theoretically? What's going on? And is this unique comparatively? So kind of the idea is I want to sort of take a historical, comparative, and theoretical perspective. See what each of those can tell us about what we're looking at, and sort of wrestle, as I've sort of tried to wrestle with the paradox and the difficulty that just so often what history seems to teach us about Myanmar or Burma before 1990, that what we know historically about the country just doesn't jibe very well with what we should expect theoretically to happen. And so I'm going to kind of end on that note and sort of think a little bit more almost like epistemologically about how do we figure out what's going on? How do we draw conclusions about what's likely to happen and why things are the way they are? So just a brief overview. So comparatively and historically, so again, to these questions, how did Myanmar get here historically and how unique is it comparatively? I think comparatively and historically, it's important to note that Myanmar is an extreme case for sure in a variety of ways. So colonialism in Burma, British colonialism was extreme in the degree to which it disrupted pre-existing ruling arrangements and then really failed to replace them with any kind of effective governing institutions in place. So it really British colonialism left a sort of terrible mess. Ethnic and geographic diversity in Burma, Myanmar, is also extreme and was really badly worsened by British practices of divide and rule, as well as by the experience of Japanese occupation during World War II, which pitted, again, in even worse ways, including essentially the country's two different militaries, pitted them against each other as well. So essentially the country becomes independent in 1948 as just an extremely fragmented, diverse, poorly governed, ungoverned kind of space. So it's sort of born into immediate civil war. And so that's the next point. The range of insurgencies, especially regionalist and separatist insurgencies that Burma has experienced and experienced right in the wake of independence, is also quite extreme. So it really kind of just went right, out of the frying pan of colonialism into the fire of these, of kind of endemic internal rebellion of different ethnic groups and rebel groups trying to separate from the country. And I would argue, and I have argued, that it was really this more than anything, these regional rebellions and just the severity of them, just how persistent they were, how prominent they were across national territory. It was really this and responding to this that gave rise to such an extremely violent, extremely cohesive, and extremely durable and really pure military regime for 50 years. So basically from 1962 until 2011, the military essentially ruled alone in a way that is very, very unusual. And so, and kind of how do we make sense of this? Pure military regimes, thinking theoretically, really aren't supposed to last like this. There aren't that many pure military regimes left in the world. But what I found in trying to make sense of this puzzle was that not just in Burma, but also in Indonesia, and this gets to start thinking a bit more comparatively here, in both Burma and in Indonesia, these endemic separatist rebellions that emerged after independence, but before the rise of military rule. So especially in the late 40s and through the 50s, these regional separatist rebellions seemed more than anything else to explain why we got these kind of decisive shifts toward military rule and very, very durable forms, lasting forms of military rule in both Indonesia and in Burma. And in my own research, this has been something that I've tried to put to further testing. I've got a forthcoming, I think it's still forthcoming, article in the British Journal of Political Science on this that tests this argument quantitatively. To what degree regional rebellions, specifically regional separatist rebellions, give rise to more militarized political regimes, and it seems to hold up pretty well globally. So there's one kind of, so rather than just thinking, well, Burma, Myanmar is entirely sui generis, it's at least one way to get some leverage on thinking there might be something systematic going on. It might give us some sense of why it is that this is such a durable military regime, and one that is able to hang together, that's able to stay cohesive, even when it uses just phenomenal amounts, just horrifying amounts of violence against its own population. Okay, so that kind of brings us to 2011. So we have this military regime that rules for 50 years. And then the puzzle becomes, why would this murderous military regime suddenly open up the political process? And particularly because it seemed to be under no immediate pressure to do so. And here again is sort of where I think the conflicting lessons of Burmese history and political science theory, and our theories of military regimes, just completely clash with each other. Because Burmese history sort of told us that this kind of opening was almost impossible, and our theories of military regimes told us that it was almost inevitable. So there's this sort of paradox of surprise with politics in Burma, in Myanmar, that no matter what happens, you can either say, well, this makes sense given the country's history, or this makes sense given certain theories we have in political science. But of course, that's not very satisfying, right? We want to have be able to do more than that in terms of making sense of these things that we see and try to unravel these contradictions. So why did this happen? So this is, again, is 10 years ago and sort of leading us up to the coup after these 10 years of political opening. And so somewhat ironically, a very different project that I was working on at the time helped me make some sense of it. So let me talk through a little bit of how I've made sense of these reforms in the last few years, given this wider book project. So the book is called Democracy Through Strength. And originally, the project started by looking at Singapore and Malaysia. And so again, this is speaking kind of what can we learn comparatively? How can we theorize the case in a comparative way? So I was sort of, it struck me that in places like Singapore and Malaysia, which were these electoral authoritarian regimes with very, very strong, very cohesive, very electorally popular ruling parties, the puzzle to me was, well, why don't they just democratize? If they democratize, they're still going to win elections. They'll actually divide their opponents, and they could really thrive after becoming democratic regimes. And the initial set of comparisons that I drew there were to Taiwan and to South Korea, because Taiwan, South Korea, also Japan to some degree, these were all places that became democracies. Taiwan and South Korea certainly did so largely kind of on their own terms. Japan, of course, did so as a result of American occupation. But after the Americans left, Japanese democracy stuck. The LDP stayed a dominant ruling party. And it just sort of seemed to me that this, at least in certain circumstances, and why in some cases but not others, authoritarian regimes that actually had the capacity to maintain a lot of their power under democracy, why would they steer clear of it? Why wouldn't they do so? And so bit by bit, as this project evolved, we started applying this to Indonesia and to Myanmar as well, although somewhat hesitantly, somewhat gingerly, because these were clearly authoritarian regimes that lacked the kind of institutional capacity, party strength, state strength that we saw in cases like Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, and Malaysia. So how does the idea of democracy through strength help us make sense? Does it help us make sense of Myanmar in the last 10 years? And both in the sense of, does it help us make sense of the reforms and why they started in 2011, and also why they're being disrupted, perhaps abandoned now in 2021? So the idea here is really that, unlike so much of what we see argued in our theories of democratization, one way democracy comes about is because dictators have very little choice. They're forced into a corner. Essentially, if they don't democratize, they could face a much, much worse fate. So they're under intense pressure to do so, and that's how it happens. But what we've found in East and Southeast Asia to a large degree is that democratization comes about not when an authoritarian regime faces little choice, but when it faces little risk. And so the idea is that they can actually, again, as I was saying, thrive, do well under more democratic conditions. And so in a case like Burma, where there had been colossal protests against the regime in 1988, again in 2007, and when these happened, the military they cracked down. They stuck together, they didn't divide, they didn't fragment, and they just stayed in power. And so it was puzzling then. So then why, if this is a regime that will use whatever level of violence it needs to stay in power when it's under direct threat, why would it then start to kind of embark on this kind of power sharing arrangement with civilians, open up democratic elections, and at least invite civilians to share some of the power in the state? Why would they do so at a moment when they were not under threat? The protests were in abeyance. There wasn't a big economic crisis per se going on. These kinds of things that we would expect. And so basically the argument that we've come up with, and that I think gives us some leverage in thinking about Burma, is that the success of democracy through strength. So again, sort of an authoritarian regime democratizing on its own terms through its own process, not negotiating an exit, but saying we will rewrite the rules in a more democratic way in the expectation that we will continue to thrive. So when they do this, there are really two keys to it continuing. And we call these victory confidence and stability confidence. And basically victory confidence is your belief that, and your confidence that you will continue, that people who support the old regime, the old authoritarian ruling party, will continue to do well in democratic elections. So that's victory confidence. And then stability confidence is the confidence that even under more democratic conditions, economic growth won't be disrupted, the country won't fall apart into civil war and chaos. So victory confidence and stability confidence are of the essence. So in watching Burma, watching Myanmar over the last, close to 10 years, these have been the things I've been thinking about, is to what degree do we expect the military's victory confidence and stability confidence to last? That those are going to be the key. Will it believe that stability and its own ability to hold on to a big share of political power is safe, even under more democratic, certainly more electoral conditions? But a wrinkle here that I think is important, and that really was drilled home to me when I was in Myanmar in 2015 and monitoring the elections, was that it just didn't seem like the military was all that concerned about the elections. The military didn't seem to worry too much about whether the party that was closest to the military, which is the USDP, they just didn't seem that concerned with how the USDP did in elections. They didn't seem that concerned with the fact that the National League for Democracy, the NLD, the party of Aung San Suu Kyi, they didn't seem that concerned that the NLD could win these landslide victories. And the reason why was because the military wrote the constitution to keep 25% of the parliament. They wrote the constitution so that Aung San Suu Kyi, who they most fear, could not become the leader of the country because she has foreign-born children. They wrote the constitution so that the only ministries that have any authority at all over security affairs, military affairs, were in the hands of the military. So they put all these safeguards in place. And so basically, as of 2015, what it seemed like was, this was a military that basically in 1990 said, so they threw elections out in 1990 when the NLD won a landslide. And they said, we're going to write a constitution and then we'll do elections once we've written a constitution. Okay. And it took them 25 years, right? It took them 18 years to write a constitution, which they wrote entirely on their own. They didn't have to negotiate it. They just wrote this constitution, right? It's written on their own terms. It's written for their own benefit. It took them 25 years to get to the point where they could have free and fair elections. And so the military is very invested in this process. And the fact of the matter is that since 2011, stability confidence, at least, should, you would think, have been fulfilled. The civilian government has, the country has never had a better decade in terms of development, in terms of stability and what have you. And so it would seem as if, from the perspective of our theory, that hopefully the military is focused on its stability confidence. And even though the NLD, the opposition, essentially the opposition, even though they won this landslide in 2015, and even though they won another landslide in 2020, that as military men, that they wouldn't be all of that threatened by what was happening in elections alone. That as long as the civilian leadership was willing to basically let the military do what it wants in terms of its military operations, which, as you see with the Rohingya massacre, genocide, right, that this is something that clearly the civilian government has not stood in the military's way, to put it mildly. And so we sort of, I think a lot of this felt like, in purely rational grounds, that the military in Burma, the military in Myanmar could look at, again, there was just another landslide election in 2020. The NLD of Aung San Suu Kyi again wins this landslide election. I think there was reason to believe that they would stay the course. They by this point spent 30 years putting this reform process in place. It's brought all this more stability to the country. It's brought all this foreign investment into the country. It's removed the country from the rogue status it had before it embarked on this, power sharing process, right? So why set it on fire, right? Why basically try to go back to pure military rule? Okay. So the question is why? So one possibility is, well, maybe victory confidence matters a lot. Maybe they really do worry about how well the USDP does in elections. That's only one possibility. Another possibility is, they were just never strong enough to embark on this. That unlike, Indonesia, which had a strong ruling party as well, had a much more effective state, a lot more experience of economic growth, bigger middle class, more success at poverty reduction. Maybe Myanmar just never was really, a candidate for doing this kind of preemptive democratization. It was just too weak to do it, right? So that's certainly one possibility. But it seems to me, and I think my provisional conclusion at the moment, and we're 10 days into this, but I really think that the big picture to me right now is that this coup, this abandonment of the reform process is collectively irrational from the perspective of the military. I do not think this is something that makes a lot of sense for the military as an institution, as an organization. But unfortunately, I think the coup is potentially quite rational, quite strategic from the perspective of the individual leader, the commander-in-chief of the military, Min Aung Hlaing, who is on the verge of a forced retirement. And so essentially, unless they do something to change the system, and that could allow him to get into civilian politics, basically he's going to be forced by the wayside. So it's possible, and I think we may look back on this, maybe sooner rather than later, but it's at least possible that unlike previous coups in Burma's history, unlike previous coups in Myanmar's history, that this is not so much the product of a unified military, but this is largely a coup that is about the leader. It's about Min Aung Hlaing and about his desire to stay in power. It's at least a possibility. Okay. But so even if this is true, so where does this leave us? So I want to kind of wrap up the talk by talking about, a set of possibilities for where this goes and how it kind of depends on, will history prevail? Will our comparative perspectives prevail? Or will our theories of political change prevail? So if history prevails, as ever in Burma, in Myanmar, we really, history gives us no reason to ever underestimate the Burmese military's capacity and their will to do damaging things and to do things that are not good for the country. Okay, this is a military that misruled the country so badly for 50 years, right? And yet still would hold on to power. And its capacity for cohesion has always been simply remarkable. So it is possible, right, that the cohesion of the military in Burma and in Myanmar, even if this is an irrational move, this is an organizationally undermining move, it's possible that this is a military with a cohesion that is just so incomparable that it will hold together. It will basically reinstall another period of military rule, and they will manage to pull this off. Okay. That would be surprising theoretically, but again, I don't think you can underestimate the military in Burma to pull this off. Okay. A second possibility is that, comparisons will prevail, that it's really our comparative perspectives that give us the best insight into what will happen. And so one thing to note here is that, in the book project I've been writing and in comparing Myanmar to Indonesia and Thailand, sort of realized the degree in which there are a lot of similarities in their democratization trajectories, right? Both in the ways in which they originally embarked on democratic reform, but also the reversibility of these reforms during times of declining military confidence. They were pretty explicitly, the military was interested in following the Indonesian model as it was first thinking about political reform. And now it seems pretty explicit that they're very interested in following the model of Thailand. So those of you who have paid attention to events in Thailand, essentially in Thailand, as in Myanmar, a very, very popular civilian government kept winning elections. The military could not put up any political party to compete with that party, and the military was threatened. Of course, in Thailand's case, the monarchy also felt threatened. And as a result, they have had a series of coups in Thailand, and they, as in Myanmar, have tried to engineer an electoral system in which basically the military cannot lose, and in which the commander-in-chief of the army, Prayut, could basically shed his military attire for a suit and become leader of the country. And so they've been much more aggressive than the military in Myanmar in terms of very widespread political bans and much tighter political controls. So I think probably the smart money at this point, in terms of at least what the military is trying to do, is trying to kind of hit the rewind button, sort of hit the reset button, go back to the drawing board a little bit, rewrite the electoral rules, and try to then open things up again once it's got in more Thai style restrictions on much wider political bans, much tighter political controls in place. So if so, we might look back on this and say that looking next door at Thailand was a pretty good, was not a bad lens through which to understand what was happening in Burma and in Myanmar. Okay. So last but not least, what about our theories? Is it possible that our theories will prevail and will end up shedding a lot of light on what happens next? But then the question is which theories that we have. So most of our theory in political science would tell us militaries just can't do this and last. They really cannot do these kinds of coups against manifestly popular civilian governments, right? This is not like a Pakistan scenario in 2000 when the civilian political class was discredited and the military swept in and people didn't really mind, right? I mean, the NLD was just reelected in another massive landslide. And on the day they were going to come back and take their seats in parliament, the coup just moves in and keeps it from happening. I mean, the unpopularity of this is so stunning, right? And the timing of it in that sense is so stunning. So our theories would tell us the military is not going to hold together. They can't stay cohesive behind this. It's going to be so hard for them to do so. There have got to be people within the military who have benefited a lot from the past 10 years of reform, that basically they're going to see instability get worse after the coup takes place, and that they're going to divide. And more professional types will sort of try to nudge the military back into these a really serious power sharing arrangement in which the military is not ruling directly, right? So that would be what we would expect theoretically, despite everything Burmese history tells us, right? I think if we, again, focus on this issue of stability confidence, right? I think that, people who ponder, whether or not to sustain authoritarian regimes take very hard looks at how stable authoritarian rule has been and how stable its predecessor was. And I think the fact that the past decade in Myanmar has gone so well compared to, obviously not for the Rohingya, right? This is not, the Rohingya are sadly irrelevant to these calculations, right? Not for the, kind of the groups on the periphery that the military is constantly fighting with, right? But in terms of the, the ruling party, in terms of the military, in terms of, elites in Myanmar in general, again, this has been a very, by all, accounts, very, in comparative perspective, a successful exit, partial exit from pure military rule. And so to the extent that we see, all kinds of problems arising from this, I think the pressure within the military and, from those who might otherwise be somewhat sympathetic to military rule could very well look back and say, we're confident enough in some kind of maybe hopefully very lightly modified electoral system and return to something like the status quo ante before the coup. I want to present one other perspective, though, which is I've been thinking about, a slightly darker thought as I ponder what's going on here. And that's if, and this goes back to some of the first research I ever did, which was on Malaysia back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And what was striking to me about Malaysia then was the regime was becoming very personalized. Mahathir Mohamad, who was the prime minister, had clearly developed this much stronger individual grip on power, despite the fact that the ruling party, UMNO, the United Malays National Organization, was this very, very strong ruling party, very institutionalized ruling party. And what I kind of took from that, and what I eventually sort of drew as a lesson from that was, ironically, in an authoritarian regime, if the ruling organization is very hierarchical, if it's very well organized, if it's very institutionalized, ironically, that gives the leader of the organization tremendous power, because everybody in the organization is used to following orders. They're used to following what the leader tells them to do. So even when the authoritarian ruler embarks on a strategy which is damaging for the regime, damaging for the country, damaging for other people within the ruling group, that it's very hard for them not to follow orders, because there's this experience with cohesion and of doing things in a cohesive way. Now, in the late 90s in Malaysia, this happened within a political party. And my argument would be that Mahathir Mohamad, by basically doing a huge crackdown and avoiding all kinds of reforms during the 1998 financial crisis, basically kind of started leading Malaysia down this kind of road to ruin for the ruling regime. Much more unstable. The regime lost its popularity. 20 years later, they get tossed out of power. But Malaysia, again, they couldn't stop Mahathir Mohamad from doing what was good for him, even though it wasn't, I would argue, good for UMNO. It wasn't good for the ruling party, right? And I'm afraid something similar might be happening in Myanmar today. That this is a military with such an extraordinary track record of cohesion, such, all its muscle memory is of doing things together, right? That when that's the case, that even if the commander-in-chief has basically decided to launch a coup, which primarily benefits him personally, and is, again, returns the military to the kind of rogue status it had, a decade ago for so long, that even if that's the case, that the military might not be able to stop him, okay? And that we might again be seeing a case where the ruler of a regime essentially holds onto power, uses that power in a much more repressive way than makes sense for anybody, obviously the people being repressed. And just to be clear here, we should be primarily focused for the moment on the fate of people who are currently imprisoned, who are currently detained. We do not know how they're doing. We don't know, what their status is, and that's I think terrifying. But that sometimes, as much as we like to, those of us in political science like to focus on these questions of the institutions and how these authoritarian regimes are organized and the predictable features they have and the way the strategic and rational action, makes sense of what they do, that sometimes, maybe the ruler of these regimes can just take it down the direction that he wants to take it down. And even if it's damaging and people don't want it to happen, and a lot of people within the regime don't want it to happen, they don't think it's the right strategy, that even when that's the case, no one might be able to stop it. So that's kind of one, concern that I've been increasingly having when trying to think through the seeming collective irrationality of this coup. So in the final analysis, I would like to think that all three of these perspectives are helpful, at least, maybe even vital. We have to be able to think historically. We have to be able to think comparatively. We have to be able to think theoretically. But it's very hard. It's very hard to know how much we know and how much we don't know. These are such different modes of thinking. And when the lessons of history and the lessons of comparison and the lessons of theory point us in such different directions, it's very hard to know how much weight to put on these different factors. So it's not just about the difficulty of predicting what's going to happen in the world, which is kind of an obvious point. I think there's a deeper problem or a deeper challenge to all of us. Those of us who do think there are patterns in the world, they do think theories teach us things, we do think comparisons can teach us things, and yet cases can be stubborn things. And histories can be very stubborn and difficult to turn in new directions, even when we think that they should. So I want to make sure to leave enough time for people to ask questions. That's hopefully a set of, at least of provocations that might get people to ask questions. So thanks for listening.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. That was a really excellent talk. So we have a lot of questions already coming in and they all look excellent. If you have not indicated that you want to unmute, then I will be reading your question. If you would prefer to ask it yourself, you have to tell me. And we are going to start by allowing Frank Fukuyama, Director of CDDRL, to ask the question. All right, Frank.
Frank is muted.
I know, I'm trying to unmute him. Technology is really being unfriendly. If Frank is not available within a few seconds, then I will go ahead and ask a different question while we wait for him. So I'll start. There's an anonymous question.
Oh, wait, okay, can you?
Oh, okay, yes.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I thought you were going to unmute me, but I had to do it myself. Okay, let me ask my question. So Dan, that was great, and I'm appreciative of your more optimistic scenario, and I really hope that works out. I had a question about China. When I visited Myanmar in the early years after the transition had started, there was a lot of speculation that one of the reasons that the military wanted to open up to the West was that they felt they were way too much too much dependent on China. The Mitsoni Dam, there's a lot of internal controversy over this for nationalist reasons. And, there was this little tension, I guess, when Aung San Suu Kyi had invited Xi to visit and looked like she may be moving in the other direction. Is this completely irrelevant? I mean, it didn't figure in your theoretical construct, the international dimension.
Yeah. No, thank you for calling attention to that. The international dimension is, of course, is a very big part of this. So at one point during the reform process, I referred to this as a double-edged détente. So essentially what was going on was the military was sort of in this position of détente with both its internal critics and its external critics. And that the question was, like any détente, it could either last or not last. And then, what were the prospects? I think that China's role here is, there's no way that China is going to be able to play a dominant role, because Myanmar, like other countries in Southeast Asia, is really quite adamant on keeping a relatively balanced portfolio of external dependencies, if you will. And so I think that they've gotten closer to Russia in recent years as well. But it's certainly the case that one thing these reforms has allowed is, for a lot of more Western investment, these Western ties, not just Western. I mean, Japan, South Korea, they're not the West. They're democracies, but they're not the West. And you have investment coming in from all over, and the risking those things, I think, is certainly a big problem. I don't think that China and other countries are as far apart on Myanmar as people often assume they are or argue they are. I thought the UN statement did a pretty good job of making it clear that everybody wanted the political process to get back on track, because China has no interest in instability in Myanmar. They want to see stability. And this is not one of these cases where, oh, well, we could either have a really sloppy, rocky democracy or this really well-run, stable authoritarian regime. And China knows that's not what this is. The opposite. And China knows this. And so I think China looks next door. They think the last 10 years has been a relative success. They'd like to see it get back on track as well. And so hopefully there will be more consensus in the international community on the need to kind of at least restore the status quo ante, or something very close to it, than we might otherwise think to be the case.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question asking what role civil society has played in both the reform process originally in 2011 and what role it might be playing now.
So civil society in Myanmar is just hugely, I mean, it's hugely impressive, I guess is the first thing I should say. I mean, the courage, the bravery of civil society in, Burma once upon a time, Myanmar today, in being willing to stand up and stand in the face of this military, which we know perfectly well what they're capable of, it's awe-inspiring, I think. And this is something the military had to know was going to happen. They could have been under no illusions that they could, do some kind of coup that people would just accept. They had to know this was going to happen. They can say all they want, well, you need to go home, you need to stop protesting, but they know they're not going to unless they use massive force. So, I mean, what's the plan? It's just not what the plan is. So I wish I could say that, that the ebbs and flows and rhythms of Burmese history and politics show that civil society prevails or that civil society is the driving force. But unfortunately, it just isn't the case. Unfortunately, the will of civil society gets overridden all the time. And it could be overridden here again. And that's, I think you certainly can't bet against that scenario. But clearly the pressure is essential. If we have any hope, and I do have hope, that the military is simply not as unified behind this coup, but this at least temporary bout of direct military rule. If we have any hope that that's the case, then protests are going to be vital to making that clear and to hopefully raising the notion within the military that this is no solution. Right, for whatever problems they're having with the NLD or whatever frustrations they have about, essentially what's a cohabitation arrangement between military and civilians. These are frustrating. It's frustrating to have to rule with, if you're a military that has to rule with civilians. Of course, it's frustrating. But compared to what things are going to turn into, so I think the protests are vital. I very much hope that the world, calls attention to them. I hope that the military, that the police, we've seen some signs of hope. The police are going to be more sympathetic than maybe some in the military. Again, these are signs that this reversal might not stick. The smart money as it will, but I think there's at least reason to think possibly that it might not, and civil society is vital there.
Okay, so there are two questions that sort of follow from this. The first is from Larry Diamond. You've already said there are probably internal divisions in the military, likely generational, especially through the military as government, between the military as government and the military as military. But what do you know about current factional structure among the senior military ranks?
I wish I knew more. I think everybody, even people who study the Burmese military, wish they knew more. Militaries tend to be very opaque institutions. This one is just opaque at another level, altogether. And so it is just so hard to know what these are. I mean, this is, again, something where we can look and see, the military in Myanmar, of course, has massive business interests. I think we know, just as a basic matter of logic, that where that's the case, that tends to create factions, that tends to create divisions. One of the first things that happened after the coup was, there was this pullback of Japanese investment in Kirin, in the beer company. So there's this immediate sense. Certainly, some people in the military are going to be hurt more than others by this. But this is a military which is remarkable. It's simply extraordinary in its ability to keep its dirty laundry, internal. And so this is, again, one of these things where I have to kind of use a sort of reasoning where it's use a kind of comparative and theoretical logic against your case knowledge, because all you can know from the case is what you can see, and all you can see is the cohesion. But so I wish I had some kind of direct evidence of the class of 87 versus the class of 92, those kinds of stories. I don't have that kind of story, but we should be, talking to those who do the best to read the tea leaves all the time and see if there's any hope of that nature. But I doubt that kind of thing is bubbling out, to be honest.
Okay, another related question from Tom Finger at FSI at Stanford asks, what accounts for the apparent depth and breadth of sentiment for democracy in Myanmar, given the sort of lack of precedent for democratization prior to the past decade and minimal contact with democracy elsewhere? You've indicated some incentives that might exist among the military, but what about, in the population?
Well, I think it's probably worth distinguishing support from democracy and support for not the ruling party, but for what is basically the dominant civilian party, for the NLD. Okay, so, and here's where I think the military is really quite foolish. I think they're being foolish in a variety of ways. But they can kind of complain about how the NLD behaves, but as long as the military keeps this big of a stake in power, the only thing that elections can be about, the only thing that can be at stake is whether or not a strong enough civilian force will be put in place to actually challenge military rule. Okay, what's very clear in terms of people's attitudes in Myanmar is extreme distaste, for military rule. I mean, they lived through this, right? They do not want the military governing them. That is extremely clear, right? And they absolutely positively want the NLD to have power, right? The by-elections in 2012, I think they won 44 of 45 seats, right? They win these massive landslides in 2015, massive landslide in 2020. Okay, so the NLD is essentially the carrier of nationalist sentiment, and as far as most Burmese are concerned, the military is like an occupying force, and they keep them from having self-rule. And Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD are what gives them self-rule. Now, does that public opinion then say, oh, well, we have to protect the human rights of the Rohingya? Of course not even close. Would this public opinion, bat an eye if the NLD, and I think they already were in some ways, starts becoming more of an electoral authoritarian ruling party in its own right? Not necessarily. So I guess I would say that there's unbelievably wide, deep, intense dislike for military rule and a desire for the NLD to take power. I don't know how much that's about what we would necessarily say is democratic values per se. I think they are different. They are different things. But again, we shouldn't be supporting the rights of the people of Myanmar because of what we think their values are. We should be supporting them because they have voted en masse in overwhelming droves for this outcome. They want the NLD to rule. They want Aung San Suu Kyi to be their leader, right? And we should respect the will of the Burmese people in a way that the military does not.
Okay. So there are a lot of questions about what an international response could do, what the Biden administration could do, what UN sanctions could do, and what you think is both likely and also what would be impactful. Could you speak to that?
Sure. So as people might know, Biden has already done this executive order to put in place some targeted sanctions. This is, by the way, this is one thing on which there's actually, there's some bipartisan support. I mean, Democrats and Republicans agree on virtually nothing anymore, it would seem. But of course, Mitch McConnell, you might know, has long been very, very invested in the Burma issue, in the Myanmar issue. So this is, I think, something where I think we'll see some bipartisan, support for some kinds of sanctions. And here, I think there's going to be a really divided opinion. This is just a very, very difficult issue. I think targeted sanctions are one thing, but a lot of people who know best and know the country best and have seen what the country went through under the sanctions regime before, and particularly given what's happening with COVID and how much damage the economy is undergoing there anyway, there's going to be a lot of pressure, even from people who, with great human rights credentials, I would say, who will really fight against a return to the kind of sweeping sanctions that we saw in the past, and who really don't believe those sanctions played a major role in prompting political reforms in the first place. So I think the most likely outcome, and I would say probably in all likelihood, the most sensible outcome, is some kind of consensus on more targeted sanctions aiming the military leaders who are involved, and trying not to do them in a way that's going to do wider economic damage. I do think, again, this is something where, again, for all of the talk of there being kind of two diametrically opposed camps, a democratic camp and an authoritarian camp in the world, and this is all good for China and bad for America and these kinds of things, I just really think that's not the way to think about this. I think there's an enormous win set, if you will. There's a huge amount of commonality in what both the United States and China want to see happen in Myanmar. I'd like to see us trying to work together as much as possible to put together some kind of united front to say, this is really self-defeating. You have got to get back onto a track where you're sharing power, and one that ideally is not going to mean, a la Thailand, just the complete, abolishing, the complete banning of the NLD as a party, because that's not going to be a route to stability.
Right. Okay, so we're going to try to allow Eric Jensen from CDDRL to speak. Eric, if you could unmute.
Right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Dan, great talk. I'd like to pose an alternative. You know, your point about collective irrationality is really well taken, but why stage a full-on coup when maybe something less drastic could have been done? If the coup boils, if the rationality of the coup boils down to the interests of the commander-in-chief of the military, why not simply rewrite the Constitution without the need for a coup and all of the sanctions that go with it and the labeling as a rogue state? Why not continue with somewhat of a Pakistan model, which is quasi-military rule with a veneer of democracy? And in rewriting the Constitution, just take into account the interests of the commander-in-chief, who may want that power for 6 to 10 years, and the political forces may then overwhelm it.
Great. I mean, great questions. And this might be where things are headed. So this is, I can't, can't emphasize enough the fact this is very much in process, right? I think the way to think about this is that they have detained the civilian leadership, and they are, to put it incredibly euphemistically, negotiating, in the sense that I think they're basically interrogating, shaking down, seeing what they can extract and what they can force out of these folks, and see kind of, it's a show of force. It's a show of military force, and we will kind of see where they wind up in terms of what they're trying to do. I think that the Pakistan scenario is difficult, again, given just how popular the NLD is. I think the other thing that's vital here is you talk about rewriting the Constitution as if that's something you could do easily, right? The fact of the matter is that the military they're kind of obsessed with this Constitution. Okay, it took them a very, very, very long time to write it, and arguably they were so invested in the Constitution that they wouldn't even change the electoral rules so that the USDP, the pro-military party, would do better. So they stuck with, insanely, if you know anything about electoral rules, they stuck with a kind of first past the post system. So a la in Egypt, right, where the Brotherhood wins even bigger, and threatens the military even more because of the electoral rules. Same story in Burma, same story in Myanmar. So rewriting the Constitution is actually a politically hard thing to do within the military. They kind of see it as their security blanket. And so there's a sacrosanct character to it. And so, again, I don't want to kind of, get into Kremlinology or anything like this, but I do think that, trying to drum up this sense that, well, the NLD stole the election. I mean, the echoes with November to January in the United States are all too, they're chilling, right? You've got a government say it's November, it's a clear electoral result, and the incumbent says, no, there was fraud, and no one's, the election commission says there's no fraud, but of course there was fraud, right? And so we have to have this do-over. So it's to think that you could talk about the United States and Myanmar in the same sentence like that is just horrifying, to be honest. So we might very well be negotiating that kind of thing, but I'm not sure that the commander-in-chief could quite as easily as you suggest just sort of say, well, let's tweak a couple features of the Constitution for some safeguards here. I mean, he looks next door to Thailand. I mean, Prayut becomes the leader of the country. I mean, this is an ambitious guy. Has extremely bad relationship with Aung San Suu Kyi. He might really, see no outcome he's happy with other than becoming leader of the country, And if so, this might be the only way that he can do it. So we shall see. I wish I had a better clear answer. I could say, no, that's not what's happening, because we might very well wind up in a scenario very much what like you're talking about.
There's a question that follows from that from one of our postdocs, Salma Musa, who's asking whether or not the civilian government could have granted any kind of conditional sort of guarantees to the military prior to this. Why didn't Aung San Suu Kyi assuage military generals that their families, their fortunes would be protected after retirement, or some way of letting them, ease into the next phase without the coup? And she's also asking how embedded the military is into broader society, whether there are a lot of different connections that the military maintains throughout the civilian economy.
Throughout the economy, yes, very much so. Not really with society. So the military is not terribly embedded in society. There's, again, almost like this occupying force kind of dimension to military-civilian relations in Myanmar. The military is very much stands apart, but they have enormous economic holdings. So this is definitely a big part of the picture. there's this old line, this old Marxist line about the bourgeoisie. They say the bourgeoisie trades the right to rule for the right to make money. Well, it's not the bourgeoisie in Southeast Asia that does that. It's the military. And in Myanmar, seemed like, well, they seem to be willing to step back from direct rule, be able to make a lot of money. But now, we'll see whether that trade is working out. I think it's certainly possible, and it's clear that there were negotiations of a sort going on before the coup, where the military was making demands of the NLD. We don't know exactly what those were. It's certainly possible they were demanding things like to bring a bunch of USDP people into the cabinet to kind of go even further in terms of power sharing. It's possible that they met resistance, it's possible it was a breakdown of that sort. But I think the way to think about this in general is that this is, a system the military put in place unilaterally. And the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi have had sort of no choice but to accept the terms that they've been kind of given. And that's been true since 1990. Again, when the Constitution was written in 2008, there was no NLD input. It was just, this is what the military said, this will be, if you want to engage in politics and have, if you want to win parliament and have any say, you will play by our rules. And so I think in the big scheme that the NLD has been admirable in how well it is kind of adapted to and settled into this kind of cohabitation arrangement with the military. I don't think the big picture is one of like, oh, if only the civilians were more tractable, if only they were more willing to negotiate. This is a case of a military which gave itself all the presents under the Christmas tree you could imagine, right? And it's still not happy. It's still not content with it. And this is, again, part of the reason why I think I cannot believe for a minute that everybody in the military thinks, yes, this is the thing to do. I can't believe that there aren't lots of people in the military who look at this, again, unless they're just so completely, embedded in this organizational culture that like the commander-in-chief says so that's what we follow, right? If they have any ability to think just rationally, strategically about this, there've got to be forces in the military thinking, this has not been a bad decade, These guys don't want to spend their lives sitting in parliament. They don't care. They want to be running businesses. They want to be able to go and fight insurgents they think are the biggest threat to the country's national integrity, right? That's what they want to do. This is exactly what they've gotten for the last 10 years. So it's very hard to see this as, if only the NLD would have been more, willing to cut a deal. I'm sure eventually we'll learn more about what was at stake, or if there was anything the military would have taken to not do this. But this has got to sit on the lap of the military. I think unless something's revealed, like there was something very reasonable that was asked, and the NLD said no. Unless and until I hear that, I think it's very unlikely that that's the kind of the dominant way to think about this.
Okay, so now we're going to go to Aaron Carter, who I'm going to allow to speak, who's one of our visiting scholars.
Great.
Aaron, if you can unmute. All right, okay. Is that working?
Fantastic. Thank you so much for an interesting presentation. I'm curious about how you think that, oops.
Sorry, there's some feedback, Aaron.
Sorry, close the other computer. Sorry about that. I'm curious how you think about the propaganda that's used in Myanmar, in particular, whether the regime uses propaganda about the Rohingya as sort of a signal to the other ethnic groups that they must comply with the regime, as a sort of signal of the regime's coercive capacity. And I'm just curious if you could sort of illuminate any of the dynamics about how propaganda may or may not be used for these sort of inter-ethnic relations in the country. Thank you.
Yeah. This is again, is a historically, widely, sweepingly unpopular military. So if propaganda has helped them, it's really helped them on the margins. Again, one of the most encouraging things we've seen in the last few days, it's terrifying, but encouraging, is that you're seeing protests emerging from all kinds of ethnic groups in Myanmar. Again, this is an unbelievably diverse place. You've seen protests of Muslim groups from the Muslim minority. You've seen protests from all around the country. And so I think this is not a military that has managed to sell its version of national history and its version of its role in national history. It has not managed to sell it to the people of Myanmar at all. And the version of history that they buy is that the hero of the country, the founder of the country, was a man named Aung San. He was the student leader. He was the military leader. He was assassinated, possibly even with British connivance, by these politicians, these pro-British politicians in the run-up to independence, and his daughter she's the successor. She's the inheritor of that legacy. That's the version of nationalism, and that's the propaganda, if you will, that is overwhelmingly what people buy and are voting for, and are, and unless and until, the military actually stands back and you sort of say, oh, well, how's the NLD actually governing? Like, oh, that's not great. I'd rather have this kind of party, or I'd rather have my ethnic group have more power. Like, if the military would just really, really stand back, as what happened in Indonesia, South Korea, for instance, then you divide the opposition. But as long as the military is just standing in the way, again, with this propaganda, all they do is they unify the opposition against them, and so they're creating their big problem is how strong the NLD is. Well, they make the NLD stronger with the way that they govern, So I think on the margins, these things might, make a difference, but this is not a military that has either succeeded at sort of nation building, trying to make everyone feel like they're part of the same country, nor have they managed to make ethnic groups feel like, oh, we're the protector that saves you from some kind of internal rival.
So in our final 4 minutes, apologies to the questions that we weren't able to get to, but I'm going to ask 2 questions, see if you can answer them quickly. The first is, what role might former generals, especially those who supported the reform in 2011, and Myanmar repats, like academics and activists who came back to facilitate the peace process, what role might they be able to play? Mm-hmm. And another question is, who provides social services? Was the NLD effective at strengthening some of the just bigger state institutions in their mm-hmm. time in power? And mm-hmm. will the military be able to sort of govern effectively, despite the fact that they've in this new era of retaking power?
Right. The military will not be able to govern effectively. That's the easiest answer, right? They never have. They have no interest in doing so. And so there's just no reason to believe that they would have anything better than the absolutely miserable, economic track record they had for 50 years. It wasn't as bad in the first decade of the 2000s, to be fair, but that actually involved a fair amount of power sharing with bureaucrats and bringing more experts into government. And it's not clear they'd have that kind of, what kind of cooperation they would have, or how well that would go. So there's not been any kind of massive increase in social services under the NLD. This is still, a place where, the role of government is very weak. There's very little redistribution. Social policy is largely kind of left in the hands of society to fend for itself, to be honest. So it's not as if the NLD's made great headway, but then again, they've been controlling only half of the state and only for 5 years. And so again, I think if we could just get beyond the politics of how much power the military has, you could actually then get, say, splinters from the NLD or competitors to the NLD saying, where's the redistribution? Where's the COVID relief? And actually get more, the way democracy is supposed to work, which is competitively and competing over issues and policies and distribution, and not just over just trying to hold on to democracy, just saying civilians should be in power. These are elections just to establish that civilians should actually have power in Burma. And so, what role could ex-generals play? What role could expats play? I just think, it's hard to say, other than on the margins. I would just say that all of these, pressures will be more effective if they're speaking with one voice, if they're sending the same signal. And I think this is something where the message can be sent to the military in a language that they understand, right? Which is the language of stability, right? This is a destabilizing move. The military should be, honestly, to a degree, proud of the fact that they were able to come up with a process, an exit strategy, which allowed them to hold on to their prerogatives and yet to also, bring civilians into the process of government in a way that has been basically stabilizing and basically successful. And I think the lesson of the military has been, you've done fine this past decade. Like, just don't burn it all up, right? Don't undo the good work that you've done. And that, speaking in the language of democratic values or what have you, I think is like, could be, again, I think for our own purposes as Americans and for trying to do something that's bipartisan, that this of course is the way that we talk about things. But I think that we really should be sending the signal internationally that, we care about stability. We care about stability in Myanmar. We do not want to see Myanmar falling apart. Like China, we care about stability in Myanmar, but the only way you get stability in Myanmar is with power sharing. The reason Myanmar has had stability of a sort for the past 10 years, terrible for some minority groups to be sure, but the reason it's been generally stable is because of power sharing. It's because the military and civilians have found a modus operandi. This destroys the modus operandi. Okay, they need to find a way to get back to that and make sure that civilians, and not just, not civilians with no political support, but that popular civilians have a meaningful role to play in government. And if not, you are not getting back to even the stability you've had in the past 10 years. That should be the message, whether you're an expat, an ex-general, anything, because that's the reality. And hopefully this will speak to people in the police, hopefully it'll speak to people in the military, and hopefully we can see, again, as fast of a U-turn, as thorough of a U-turn from this, I think, massive misstep as we could possibly, try to encourage.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for this amazing set of thoughts, really bringing clarity to a really rapidly changing situation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and we hope that all of you stay safe. Have a good week. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation.